Hey everyone, and welcome to Risky Business. My name's Patrick Gray. We've got a great show for you today, actually. It's full of intrigue and dumb bugs and criminal activity and basically everything. It's a real mixed bag, but a very fun show coming up. So we'll be talking with Adam Boileau in just a moment, going through all of the week's security news. And then we'll be hearing from this week's sponsor, which is Okta. And this is actually a cracking sponsor interview this week. Alex Tilley, who people in Australia would remember as our friendly local Fed. He worked for a long time as an investigator for the Australian Federal Police. These days, he's in a threat intelligence role at Okta. And he's got his hands on so much data there to crunch and analyze. And today we're going to be talking to him about how he's going about identifying a lot of these fake North Korean workers using threat intelligence from like login events and whatnot. It is a really interesting interview. I let it run a little bit long because it's just very compelling stuff, and I would recommend that you stick around for that one. But let's get into the news now, Adam. And as I said, there's we got a whole broad array of stuff to cover this week, but let's start with a bit of intrigue. There's a group, what are they calling themselves again?
Errors leaks.
Errors leaks, yeah. So these guys, presumably guys, have just decided that they want to live dangerous lives, right? So their business is apparently offering documents stolen from various intelligence services for sale over Telegram. And they have given some pretty juicy documents to the New York Times as like a free sample and a way to advertise their service. This won't end badly for them at all.
No, not at all. Not at all. They claim to have gotten hold of some documents from the Russian FSB, the intelligence apparatus, and one of the samples that they provided to the New York Times related to how China, to the intelligence capability that Russia uses against China, the spy on WeChat conversation, or something, which, you would kind of expect Russian intelligence to be up in Chinese comms. That seems relevant to them. But yeah, this does feel like living a little bit dangerously. They won't say, where they got the data from, but they are. They also advertise to buy data from intelligence agencies. So they post on Telegram and say, hey, if you work in, an Indian intelligence agency, we'd love to hear from you. And then they package it up and they sell it on, which, it's very 2025. So that's nice.
Is. Yeah, but you do wonder if they're going to get a case of the Windows,
Well, yes, exactly. Especially like selling stuff from the FSB like that.
On Telegram, which is known to cooperate with Russian intelligence services as well.
Do you want to flood a window? Do you want to get Novichok in your underpants? Like, none of this ends well.
Yeah, now the New York Times can't definitively say if these documents are legit, but they have done their homework on it. They've reached out to a bunch of Western intelligence agencies, and some of their sources have said, well, this seems to vibe with what we understand as they're doing as well. And other people have looked at the documents and said, this looks like legit, Russian intelligence documents. And then, of course, the New York Times has spun out a couple of stories about the content of the documents. I think the most interesting one is about how suspicious Russia's intelligence services are of China, and really looking at Chinese efforts to steal things like military, technology secrets and whatnot from Russia. They're also really trying to understand the capabilities of the Western weaponry being used in Ukraine for obvious reasons. The WeChat stuff, though, I thought was a little bit weak because this Times piece doesn't really go into actually how they're alleging this data came to be obtained. Like, is it just from like malware on an endpoint? It says that there's an agreement that WeChat data is hosted in Russia for Russians. So maybe they just have legit access to that data in the first place. So I actually found that one the least compelling angle to all of the material they accessed.
Yeah, I think that it sounded more like that was tooling for processing the data, so less about access to it, but more about integrating it into the kind of intelligence pipeline. But that's the kind of stuff that, is workaday at an intelligence agency, is that kind of processing.
Yeah, so it's like the least exciting thing, which is they have a tool for processing dumped like WeChat logs. Like, who cares?
But it's bread and butter stuff though, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think the thing that was interesting about that, though, is they said that quite often these Russians who have been targeted by Chinese services don't realize they're talking to Chinese spies on WeChat and whatnot. So, I I think these stories are worth reading. So check out this week's show notes if you would like. Meanwhile, we've got a report here that Ukraine's military intelligence folks have stolen a bunch of sensitive information from Tupolev, which makes, long-range strategic bombers and things like that. Although I can't say I'm impressed when they say that they got away with a whopping 4.4 gigabytes of data, because that seems like one person's mail spool kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, these days that's not an impressive amount of data, but once upon a time that would have been quite a lot. And maybe Tupolev's information systems are, from the Soviet era where, 4.4 gigabytes in Soviet times, that would be quite a lot. So, there could be old file formats that are very small. I don't know. But yeah, I guess this is a hot story just because of the Ukrainians' attack on a whole bunch of Tupolev bombers with the drones that we talked about a little bit last week. So Tupolev is kind of fresh in the mind, and it's a bit of a finger in the eye, thumb in the eye.
They defaced the website with their logo as well. Yes. But they say they've got sensitive data on like internal communications, personnel files, purchase records, notes from closed door meetings, blah, 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 blah. But these drone attacks in Ukraine are ongoing too. Like, everybody was very focused on the attacks against the airfields, but like they keep attacking all sorts of other stuff like munitions factories, trains, all sorts. So that's still going. That piece was written by Darina Antonyuk, who is based in Kiev. She's Ukrainian and based in Kiev, and I saw some very upsetting posts from her when she was hunkered down, and it was raining, drones and missiles on Kiev. And Darina, we hope you're okay. And it's a horrible situation. I was very relieved, in fact. She had posted that she was scared she was going to die. So I was very relieved to see subsequent posts that she survived the most recent bombardment, and continuing to deliver such quality work in such difficult circumstances. I think it's commendable. So good on you, Darina. Okay, let's move on now, and we've got some work out of iVerify, who do iOS focused security stuff. They've found a bunch of artifacts on devices they've analyzed, which suggests those devices have been owned via some sort of iMessage exploit. Apple is kind of being weaselly about it. I guess the most interesting thing about this is iVerify says that some of the targets of this campaign, where they don't quite have the bug pinned down, but they're like, there's evidence of exploitation here. They were targeting the Harris-Walz campaign, which, look, honestly, those people getting quality malware and exploits dropped on them should not be at all surprising.
Yeah, I mean, they seem like pretty legitimate intelligence targets for some people, but the iVerify does have kind of a unique perspective, because they're one of the few companies other than Apple that gets to collect crash dumps and logs and stuff from a really quite large swathe of Apple devices. And what they've kind of pieced together here is that there are a bunch of crash dumps, in a funny sort of place, combined with some targeting information and whatever else. And they sort of, pulled the thread a little bit. And what they've arrived at is that they think someone has been exploiting a bug that Apple patched, I think, earlier this year in 18.3, something like that.
Yeah.
And the bug appears to be in the processing of avatar updates via iMessage. So sometimes when you're using iMessage, you'll get a thing that's saying, your friend has updated their contact photo. Do you want to update it in your address book? And so that particular type of message is processing image data, from this kind of contact update, and it's doing so in a way that apparently was not was able to escape the sandbox that's normally around image processing in iMessage, just because I guess it was maybe the contacts bit works a little bit differently. Anyway, that's kind of where they were thinking. iVerify are pretty careful to say that they don't have conclusive proof. This is kind of circumstantial. And, Apple says they patched the bug in this area. So, the kind of dots kind of line up. But it's always interesting when you see this research from iVerify because of their, parallel perspective to what Apple has.
I mean, the thing they point to is really rare crash dumps. And that is the sort of thing that tends to get you snapped. If you are, if you've written an exploit and you're deploying it against iPhones and you generate a weird crash dump, like, that bug is getting crushed. And I know that this is something that keeps people awake who develop these exploits, because I've talked to them about it, and they're like, you cannot generate a crash on an iPhone because then your bug is going away. So looks like, that may be what has happened here. It's weird that Apple's saying nothing to see here, though.
Yeah,
maybe
like
they know something we
there's-
don't, but,
Yeah, they must know something we don't know. There must be some other aspect that, means that they're not willing to talk about it. But yeah, it's still good work. And I'm glad that somebody is kind of keeping an eye on it, because we do have to, because of that Apple ecosystem is so closed, we have to put so much faith in Apple. So it's kind of nice to have somebody else, just kind of keeping an eye and checking what they're up to.
Even though, I mean, I would argue Apple probably has the best team out there.
Yes.
Almost certainly has the best
almost no
team
visibility into what their team is doing. So.
No, I agree with you. It's like trust but verify. iVerify, there you go. Maybe that's why they named it that. But yeah, I also just want to point out too that, we're just saying, like, if you're in a role like that, you are going to get targeted by high quality malware, by high quality exploits. I mean, this is why you don't discuss imminent military actions on your Signal group chat. But anyway. Suzanne Smalley over at The Record has this report. A bunch of people have reported this. Paragon, the spyware manufacturer that had already, I believe, suspended its relationship with Italy because there was an allegation that the Italian government had deployed its spyware against a journalist. It has now terminated completely its contract with Italy. The interesting thing in this, though, is that Paragon say they had found a way that with Italy's cooperation, they could have verified that this journalist wasn't targeted, and Italy refused to do it. Okay, so, which is interesting because Italy is saying, oh no, this person wasn't targeted at all, never happened. And then Paragon's like, well, here's a way we can check. And they're like, no, thank you. So I think that tells you all you need to know.
Well, yeah, exactly. There's sort of like a process going on in Italy at the moment where they're, investigating these allegations, and there's like parliamentary committees or whatever the structure is there that have been looking into it. And in this process, Paragon was, trying to keep their name out of the mud, I suppose. And they showed up with this offer, and the Department of Information for Security, which oversees the intelligence agencies in the country, basically said, like, yeah, this is a bit invasive. It's, what do they say? Invasive practices, unverifiable in scope, results, method, and therefore not compliant with national security requirements. So we don't want to let Paragon in to go process the logs from Paragon's infrastructure, or whatever bits of plumbing are around it. So yeah, like, as you say, like, we can read between those lines, I guess.
I mean, look, it could be some sort of compliance issue, but either way, Paragon's made the right decision, which is, well, if you can't prove to us to this bar that you haven't done the bad thing that everyone's saying you're doing, well, we're just not going to do business with you. I mean, there's been the parliamentary inquiry into all of this in Italy says that that spyware was used against sort of immigration activists who worked to save immigrants at sea. I mean, again, it's hard to know. Context is everything when you're talking about that sort of thing, because should people be targeted for activism, being activists? Like, no. But once you start getting into the area of, like, well, who are you dealing with as part of this, and is there involvement of foreign actors and whatever, and, like, are you using this to collect evidence to press charges, or are you just trying to collect intelligence to understand if there's a nexus between these people and foreign actors who might be up to no good? Like, it all gets pretty fraught, but I think Paragon ultimately has made the right decision here.
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated because, outsourcing this kind of responsibility to a private organization instead of a government, you end up with all these kind of things, but they don't have the necessary information to make good decisions. You can't share it with them. This is sovereign state business, but they're using private sector tooling, and we can't really expect private sector companies to hold sovereign states.
But that's what happened in this time, in this
other
case.
than just not selling them in the first place, right? There's no granularity to that, I guess is what I mean.
Well, I mean, the irony here is that in this case, it's a private sector supplier providing oversight over a government, not the other way around, right?
Yes,
so it's a bit of
exactly what I mean. We can't expect them to take that role because,
Well, I think we kind of are, though, right? Like, that is kind of how it's working out, which is that, like, if you don't want to get sanctioned and have an awful time, you kind of have to put that oversight on your customers, or you're going to have a bad time.
Yeah, but I mean, that's not a, if the only tool you have is to not sell your product to them in the first place, or just withdraw it after the fact, that's pretty blunt.
I don't know, works for me.
Yeah,
works for me.
Fair enough, right? Yeah.
Now, look, we've got a bunch of mobile stuff to talk about this week, including this next story. Lorenzo has this one over at TechCrunch. Qualcomm has patched a bunch of bugs in its, chipsets or whatnot. And these things were being exploited in the wild. And this is thanks to some work out of Google Tag.
Yeah, these bugs all seem to be in graphics driver implementations. So it looks like one of the Google researchers either found an interesting bug or saw some crash dumps or something that led them to go have a nose around in Qualcomm's graphics plumbing. And they've got a bunch of bugs that are, critical severity or related, which basically say you can go via the GPU into, I presume code exec and the kernel or memory leaks or whatever else. So, that's a complicated set of attack surface in the graphics environment, and, mobile devices are just as complicated as everything else these days. So, good work to Google finding some cool bugs.
Yeah, I guess one of the issues with all of this, though, is that patching them, it's going to be up to the individual handset manufacturers because it's in Qualcomm drivers, not in Android itself, right? So that always gets a bit... that's the age-old problem with Android, I guess.
Yeah, it takes a while to percolate through the ecosystem.
Now, some business news, some sort of, mobile exploit development business news. Corellium is being acquired by Cellebrite for $200 million. Now, Corellium, of course, is a company that makes I guess, how do you even describe Corellium? It's like they offer virtualized iOS environments that people can use that are very handy when you're doing exploit development. I mean, it does have uses outside of that as well, but I think where it's most commercially successful is as a tool used by people who are doing exploitation on iOS. They even offer iOS over cloud, right? It's pretty crazy. And, Apple even sued them trying to say that it was a copyright problem or whatever. Amazingly, Corellium actually won that one. We've had Chris Wade on the show before. He's the founder of Corellium, an Australian guy, actually, who grew up not too far from where I'm sitting. And, $200 million for Chris Wade and co. To sell off Corellium to Cellebrite, which is, it seems like a logical place for Corellium to wind up.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's... it is a pretty niche tool, but so is Cellebrite. They've got, for them being able to test their products on these kinds of virtualized devices. I mean, anyone who's had to maintain a pool of test mobile devices, where you've got different device configurations. I mean, in the Apple world, it's bad because there's all these devices and all these iOS versions you have to maintain. In the Android world, it's even worse because now we're dealing with, hey, I need to test a Qualcomm exploit. We need a, Android all the versions, but we also need all the different Qualcomm chipsets and other vendors, modem chipsets, and it gets, that's a hard problem to solve. And having it virtualized in the cloud environment, super handy for a researcher. So I can totally see why, Cellebrite's nerds would be like, hey, that would be super handy to have in the lab.
Yeah, but I mean, they bought the company, not just the product, right? So I think I don't think it's just going to be a case where they'll take it for in-house use and no one else will be able to use it. I think it's just going to be one of their products. I mean, this whole deal is subject to CFIUS review, but I don't think there's going to be any dramas there. But yeah, they do cover Android as well. I mean, it's exactly what you say. And even companies that have to manage an app that winds up on a really large array of devices and they have to work, it's very useful technology for them. But I just think it's crazy to see that, you had this company that Apple were really trying to shut it down. And, they managed to actually get through that unscathed after appeals, everything, and sold the company for $200 million. So congratulations to them. Now, we got this one from 404 Media about Apple giving up push notifications to people, right? So governments are requesting information on push notifications. I feel like the story here, not intentionally, but is a little bit misleading because it says push notification data can sometimes include the unencrypted content of notifications. And there have been requests from the US, UK, Germany, and Israel. I mean, sure, you might get some unencrypted data in a push notification, if you've given Apple a warrant, but that's not going to be like an E2EE, messaging app like, Signal or WhatsApp. This is going to be much more boring stuff than that.
Yeah. There's basically two patterns by which people use these messaging, the push notifications. So apps kind of register with Apple to get an identifier to deliver a message to their particular user in their app context. And then when the backend system wants to send a message, it forms up a message, sends it to Apple's endpoint with that particular token, and that causes it to be routed out to the user. And those messages can either be here is a message, here's what the pop-up is going to display, the icon, the type, and the message. Or it can just be go wake this application up and tell it that there's something for it to do. And in most cases where you're handling sensitive content like Signal, that's what they're using. They're just getting, Signal gets a message saying, hey, something's happened, go poll the server and get what you need. And those are not displayed to the user. Those are just internal app things. And then the app can generate its own pop-up message to alert the user once it's gone and got the relevant context. So most of the time you're going to be seeing really boring content in your push notifications. It's going to be, the lights at your Apple home got set to 40% or whatever. Right,
your car is fully charged if you have an EV. Charged.
Yeah. So like the metadata aspect of it, like if you're looking at metadata for timing and saying like, hey, there's a notification going to a crypto wallet app about the time we saw some crypto get stolen, that might be a useful correlation point.
And even just message timing back and forth and whatever, like there's plenty of useful stuff. So I think it's not at all surprising really that we're seeing this sort of data.
No, it's a natural thing that, law enforcement can get a warrant to go get from Apple, and, the list of things you can get out of them is not super huge.
Yeah, I think we had another one from 404 that I don't believe made it to the final run sheet, but it was about how airlines were selling like passenger manifest information to the US government. And it's funny, right? Because you and I both agreed that this is like a story for 404. But like if the government didn't have access to that information, it would be a story for the Washington Post. Like that would be the scandal if the government didn't know who was flying around on planes all the time.
Yeah, exactly.
It's all in the eye of the beholder, I guess. What else have we got here? We've got some research. Again, 404, Joe Cox was the first one to have this. It's some research by a guy who's figured out how to brute force the phone number out of like a Google account, which would be very, very useful in the context of doing things like SIM swapping attacks and whatever. Google shouldn't be coughing up that information. I believe they've now fixed this issue.
Yeah, it was interesting research. The person who found this basically chain together a couple of things. Like the core guts of it is they can turn a Google account into a full name and a phone number, which that's hella useful. And there's a couple of tricks. The phone number was a case of brute forcing it out of the password reset flow using the non-JavaScript version. So like Google has an old legacy version of the password reset flow that doesn't use JavaScript, and the kind of anti-bot scraping protection stuff was tied to like a JavaScript proof of work process. And then if you hit it in the non-JavaScript way, you would get a captcha, and that was the kind of how that control was meant to work. But this guy figured out that you could take the proof of work that you did in the JavaScript version of the thing and submit that to the non-JavaScript version's endpoint, and it would be like, oh, okay, so I don't need to capture them. And at that point, now he can brute force phone numbers. And then combined with getting a username out of some other, like some obscure Google app that no one's ever heard of, would cough up a full name in a particular case. So he was able to kind of join the dots and turn this into something. Google ended up giving him, I think, $5,000 as a bug bounty, which, yeah, seems fair.
Oh, it seems a little stingy to me, man, if I'm honest. Like, okay, it's not worth $100K, but $5? Really?
I mean, they originally gave him $1,337 and he went back and had a sook.
Okay, yeah, good. Well, I'm glad he did that because, yeah, $1,337 is an insult, I think. Another one from Dorina over at The Record, and this one's interesting, right? Because Luma Stealer Luma Stealer, whatever you want to call it, this was one of those botnets that was taken down recently. It was like an info stealer botnet, and what was really interesting is Catalan wrote that up in his newsletter for us, Risky Business News, which if you're not subscribed, head over to risky.biz and subscribe to that. We also do a 3 times weekly news bulletin based on his newsletter in the Risky Bulletin podcast feed. But he wrote that basically this meant Luma Stealer were done, right? Like even if they were going to try to recover, the people were going to move on. What was interesting is I had someone from the CTI world reach out and say, look, that was a really good write-up, but they're trying to bring it back online now. And, you know, they might succeed. And Catalan in our internal chats just said, no way, man, they're finished. And it looks like this Accreed info stealer is really taking over market share from where Llama Stealer used to be. So I think, as usual, Catalan, the final boss of like macro threat intel, appears to have been right on this one.
That guy just huffs so much InfoSec news all day, every day that he just kind of gets it. So it's a dog eat dog world over there in Russian cybercrime. So it makes sense that there's someone waiting in the wings who are taking over.
Yeah, I mean, you can sort of cut the news two ways, can't you? You can say, well, the bad news here is that that people have access to other info stealers, but the good news here is the disruption appeared to stick.
Yes.
And it's just, I think really the success of all of these recent law enforcement actions, they can't be a point in time exercise. They can't be, they always say, oh, it's operation, whatever. You can't just have a single operation, and it's great to take down all of these services at once. There will be an impact, but all of this stuff has got to be rolling. You've got to have a process for it. It's got to be happening all the time, right? So, okay, a Creed has taken over. Hit him. Hit him soon. Don't turn it into the next 18-month operation. But I think we're a way away from that, but definitely things are moving in the right direction, as evidenced by this story from John Grigg over at The Record as well, which is the darknet forum BidenCash has been taken down by the Americans and the Dutch.
The Dutch always do seem to be the ones that come out swinging against this stuff. They seem to be involved in basically every one of these that we report on. But they just keep knocking them down. And the BidenCash was just funny because of the branding. I mean, it's I don't know. There's just something funny about Joe Biden's face in the login screen of
very nice photos too.
Yeah, they're good photos. So
looking very handsome in the way that US politicians can,
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah, but just kind of run of the mill cybercrime kind of stuff. But it's just fun.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so Alexander Martin, again at The Record, has reported that the National Health System in the UK has issued a call out for more people to donate blood. They say they need 1 million blood donors because at the moment their stocks are not doing so well. They particularly need O-type blood. And this is because of that ransomware attack. I think it was against that pathology place. We spoke about that like maybe last year. And so it's got real bad. Like this disruption due to a cyber attack has led to shortages in national blood stocks. So, I mean, this is just one of those stories you talk about because it's a sign of, the dystopian hell we live in, right?
Yeah, it is. I think in this case, because the pathology system was grinding under the load and with all of the other things that were going on with it, they were forced to use more generic O-type blood because they weren't getting results for tests back from people fast enough to then use more specific blood types that they had available. So that's kind of the mechanism of this. And so now they've diminished their stocks of generic blood and they need to replenish that because that's the stuff you need, in a real emergency when you don't have information, you don't have time to do tests and get something more specific. I guess if you are an O-type blood person in the UK, then this is a time for you to go do your duty and, provide some juice.
Yeah, I mean, it's important stuff, right? So if you are a listener in the UK and you can find a way to give blood, we would hope that you would do that. Yet one more from The Record. They are covering this ransomware incident targeting United Natural Foods. So they've issued a statement. They've filed documents with the SEC. The attack apparently began on June 5, and it is disrupting their ability to fulfill customer orders. Now, the reason this is news is because they are a massive distributor of foods in the United States.
Yeah, I think Catalan had some details that said like this was the biggest distributor.
I saw you fact checking him in Slack this morning. Yeah, and you're like, "Are you sure?" And he's like, "Here you go."
Yeah. Pointed me to some links, but they provide most of the distribution for Whole Foods, which is of course a very big chain in the US, and a bunch of other things. It does sound like they are still managing to do some of the deliveries, and they're kind of prioritizing. But this is what was it, $8 billion last quarter? These are, $30 billion a year food distribution business. That's pretty serious stuff. And, this can turn, there could be long tails to disruptions to this kind of ecosystem, much like with the blood system we were just talking about. So messy, very messy.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, when you get a disruption to like a major component of your food supply, like what does that do for farmers? What does it do for supermarket earnings? Like, there's just all sorts of stuff that can go sideways. So, it's interesting that this one, well, I guess it's only just recently kicked off, but as a public incident, but I mean, this would have been sort of more front page news 5 years ago. It's amazing how tolerated this sort of stuff is now. I would hope that there's a windowless basement somewhere where people are cooking up a response. I would think that if anything hits the threshold, this would be it.
Yeah, I mean, you'd certainly hope so. And I remember when we saw, what was it, JBS Meats a few years back, and we were covering that, and that was, getting quite a bit of mainstream press coverage as well as in the meat press. So yeah, you would hope that.
Well, I think the thing that'll move the needle on press coverage is if people go to Whole Foods and they can't buy their potatoes or whatever. Like that's when that's when it starts kicking off. So,
but yeah, the windowless basement people, I'm sure, hopefully they are thinking about, where their hound's at.
Yeah, there's also been an attack against a company in Ohio called Kettering Health. This disrupted their operations. Looks like they're all back up and running now, though.
Yes, I think it was a small, 14 medical centers and care facilities. Yeah. In Ohio. So
we don't have it in the run sheet or in the show notes, but I think Marks and Spencer are mostly back online now, which is about time, right? But geez, what a incident that was.
Yeah, I think they've got like some online ordering is back, so not all of the services. You can't like click and collect yet, but there are some aspects of it. So that's, it's taken them a while to claw their way back, and they've still got a way to go.
Yeah, well, when you got to rebuild your whole environment, like while you're being attacked, it does tend to take some time, right? So Now we're going to talk about, look, I actually think this is one of the most interesting stories of the week. And you're like, when we've talked about this previously, you're like, oh, well, it's dumb, but it works. I don't think it's dumb. I think this is the sort of thing we're going to see an awful lot more of. And that is hackers using voice phishing or social engineering, really. Let's not call it voice phishing. Let's just call it social engineering to trick people into authorizing a malicious app into their Salesforce tenant and like connecting an app into their Salesforce tenant that allows them to siphon off the data. Now, the reason I find this such an interesting story is because I don't really know how you would go about addressing this threat beyond making sure that the only people who are authorized to make those app authorizations really understand what they're doing. And that is not going to be possible everywhere. So, on one hand, okay, it's a bit of a dumb attack. Well, kinda, but it really does exploit, it requires knowledge of Salesforce, how it works, how these app authorizations work. And, Salesforce are doing the typical thing of like, well, there's no vulnerability in Salesforce. It's like, no, this is more of a like your architecture allows this to happen kind of issue. I mean, walk us through this one, man, because like this goes back to, I think, stuff that was first highlighted by Salesforce back in March, but now Google, I think it's tag again, isn't it?
I think so, yes.
Yeah, so Google is actually sounding the alarm on this because they're starting to see it. So yeah, walk us through exactly what's happening here.
Yeah, so the deal here is that essentially people are social engineering you to, authorize an app into your Salesforce. But why this is really clever is, and like, that your point, like it's dumb technically, but it's also really clever, right? And the clever part is that we have mechanisms to address credential theft now. We have things that deal with, multi-factor auth ultimately is about preventing credential theft from being useful. And phishing for code exec is kind of much harder than it used to be. All of the software as a service apps have a bunch of other protections around it, but that kind of whole, how do we share data between applications? How do we authorize stuff, things like OAuth, app permissions and so on? That's the bit that is still, is taking over from this. And so this is targeting that authorization process with basically cloned copies of Salesforce's real apps. So like things that you'd use for integration and calling via Salesforce APIs. So attackers will take one of those, modify it to be able to do the other things that are, extract data in bulk, whatever, and then get that authorization process through the regular flow just to a different app or a different endpoint or whatever else that the attacker is running. And to someone who is being socialed, like, computers are mysterious enough to start with, but most people understand username and password, and they can recognize that giving someone my password is going to do a bad thing, and I shouldn't do that, or I should at least be aware that something can happen to me. But something like OAuth app authorizations or whatever are so opaque to most people, and they're opaque to us. Like, we work and report in this field, and like, I was using Google Cloud stuff the other day, and I had to click through some authorization stuff into our Corpo G Suite, and it's like, I'm gonna just click yes because I don't understand what it's asking me, right? And I'm an expert at this.
Yeah.
And if you social me like that, it would hella work, because cloud stuff moves so quickly. It's so opaque. There's no way to inspect it. You know, if you showed up and asked a Windows user, can I apply this particular, NTFS, tree permission mask or whatever else, you'd have no idea what it meant. And we're in the same world now, except that it's all software as a service, so we can't see the insights.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I work with Push Security as an advisor, and they've been saying some interesting stuff, like about how, attackers are going after like OAuth grants, like not through your primary IDP. So, and this is a perfect example of that, right? So you might log into Salesforce through some OAuth grant or SSO process, but then you're doing a separate authorization which isn't tied back to your primary like IDP account at all. So the only way you're going to be able to address this, I think, and I don't know that Push, I mean, like maybe they do, they'll ring me up and yell at me if I get this wrong, but I don't think they've got anything at the moment that would defeat this in particular. I think it would be easy enough for them to do something here, but then you've got to look at like, well, where does the intelligence come from that can let you know if this app someone is trying to authorize into a Salesforce tenant is okay? Right? And we've got other issues that are very similar to this. It's all browser stuff, right? So you look at the issue of Chrome extensions. A while back, we chatted about some work by a guy called John Tuckner, who runs a small company called SecureAnnex. And they do sort of threat intel, I guess you would call it, on Chrome extensions or browser extensions generally, and other extensions in the developer world and whatnot. And it's really interesting because what they can do is look at, well, has the ownership changed of this app that you're using? Is this one known bad? Is it using weird code? Like, they can do some sort of analysis of them, and they're getting some pretty high fidelity and reliable data. But then, okay, what do you then do with that information, right? So if you've got a situation where you're allow listing apps, like you could use that information to figure out when one of them has turned. But like in terms of like, if you want anything at all sort of open and permissive, at what level do you start instrumenting that?
Yeah.
You know, and it gets really hard. So again, I find this an interesting story because like we don't quite have a standard agreed upon approach yet for dealing with this. You need something that can do the control of the OAuth event. You need something that can block it, but you also need the intelligence to let you know when you should block it. And we don't really have either of those things just yet.
Yeah, and also in the case of SaaS vendors like Salesforce, we also need basically their cooperation. Like, they need to care about, explain, document, monitor, alert on all these kinds of events inside their apps. I mean, we're used to layering controls around the outside. We have things like OAuth that standardize some aspects of that process, but like this bit might not even be OAuth. Like, it may be some Salesforce internal business that someone like Push is never going to know about until they've got customers that particularly demand it. And then at that point, you are distributing the effort required to implement these controls across hundreds of apps.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. I mean, so much of this stuff, you know, if you take the top 100, right? Whether it's GitHub, Snowflake, Salesforce, right? Like you can cover most bases there. But like, as you said, this might not actually be OAuth. I mean, I've been talking about it as being an OAuth grant. It might not actually be OAuth. It might be some sort of other authorization process. But the point is, like, even if you're in a position to instrument that and block it, how do you know what to block?
Yes. Yeah. On what basis are you going to make a choice? And then if you're going to have to ask the user, is this what you meant? Right now, they were involved in that. Like, this is the consequence of fixing passwords. Yeah. Right. Of making phishing resistant auth a standard kind of thing, of us moving to, YubiKeys and FIDO tokens and passkeys and so on. Like, if we make stealing auth difficult, do attackers stop? Especially ones that are like, I think this is the com-esque group.
Yes.
Like, people who are pragmatic and kind of don't care about our infosec, our poor infosec people having to do this the right way, or the cool hacker way from the 90s. Right. This is people who just want to get it done, and they'll do what it takes. And hey, if you can't steal passwords, why not steal authorisations or integrations or API tokens or and whatever else you can get.
Yeah, and I will say too, I think what John Tuckner's doing on the sort of browser extension side over at SecureAnnex, I think it's really cool. I wish him all the best with that. I mean, I think it's interesting that he seems to be taking the sort of intelligence approach, which means that if you're a vendor which is in a position to do stuff around extensions, you can take that data and do stuff with it. I think mostly what their customers, early customers, it's early days, mostly what they're doing is just like, we use these apps, keep an eye on them. That seems to be the early business case there, but I think we need more thinking like that.
Yes,
so I think it's very cool. But we spoke about like attributions and threat intel and whatnot last week. I just want to read you a paragraph from this Cybersecurity Dave report by David Jones about all of this, which says, Larson said there are broad overlaps between the Salesforce hackers and an underground collective known as the Com, which includes the notorious cybercrime gang dubbed Scattered Spider. Larson cautioned, however, that the threat actor involved in the Salesforce attacks is a distinct group from the threat group tracked as UNC 3944, which overlaps with a subset of Scattered Spider activity. Well, I'm glad we cleared that up. So it's, look, as I've always said about the Com stuff, Scattered Spider, Lapsus, it's not a group, it's a vibe.
Yeah, exactly. It's a feeling.
It's a feeling. It's a vibe.
Feeling.
All right. So, we've linked through to the report on Cybersecurity Dive and also the March post from Salesforce about all of that. Now, another bit of interesting technical work from Shubham Shah, who is a terrific Australian hacker and the co-founder of Assetnote. He's built a tool that allows you to inspect the internet from the IP ranges of, cloud computing environments and CDNs and whatnot that are typically trusted in ways that they just shouldn't be. So why don't you give the background on why this is interesting?
Yeah, so there's a lot of places where, in the old days, we relied on origin network or, source network addresses to kind of make access control decisions. And then as things became a bit more fluid and people started pushing stuff up into the cloud, a lot of times we kept those traditional controls, but now we're using them from an environment where we don't strictly control the origin networks anymore. Those origin networks are now operated by Google or Amazon or Microsoft or whoever else. And you can just go buy access into those environments. And so a lot of people have, end up with access control rules or policies that, they've just opened it up to a whole swathe of the network, and also understanding how big those ranges are, where you're going to be coming from, if they're dynamic, is all kind of complicated. So a lot of people just let stuff in. And so if you pop up in one of those environments, sometimes you'll get elevated access. And Shubs' tool, you basically give it, here's a list of URLs I care about, here's a service that I'd like you to check from, and it will just go spin up connections through EC2 instances or through Amazon's other APIs or through Azure functions or whatever else.
And from different regions as well, right?
From different regions, from different locations, like near your target, far away from your target, and just try and find some combination that gets you something that you didn't expect, which, it's the sort of very pragmatic hacking that we expect from that crew, from Shubs and pals.
Yeah, I mean, I think I thought it was really cool. I messaged him, I said, this is really cool, man. I dig it. I mean, he points out that GitLab's official advice is to whitelist the entire GCP region that their shared runners are in. Right?
Yes, yeah, exactly, right, yeah.
Come on. So I guess what he's getting at is, you might discover through whatever process a domain name that for some reason, whatever it is, you can't hit it. But then you throw that into, as you said, into this tool, and you might say, oh, look, I can reach it from AWS East or whatever. And then, it's party time. I mean, tricks like these, we've also seen being used to discover the origins. I mean, similar techniques, I guess, used to discover the origins of things that are behind CDNs and whatever. But, you might even find access to different services based on this, right? So you might not be able to hit SSH from the raw internet, but you can from a GCP IP range, right? You're going to see stuff like that.
Yeah, oh, yeah, absolutely, yeah, and you will find treasure. I mean, I know my pen testing days. There sometimes just popping out of Amazon or popping out of a cloud provider somewhere else. You get treasure.
You do,
and
you do.
You find joy.
Now, speaking of treasure, let's talk about Ross Ulbricht, because he has received a mysterious $31 million donation from someone who's linked to a different underground marketplace on the internet, and the whole thing is extremely suspicious. People are saying, well, it just might be someone who made a lot of money out of doing online crime, who considered him a inspiration. I mean, it could also be that he gave someone 300 Bitcoins to hold for him, and he's getting repaid now that he's out of prison. So, I mean, it feels like a little bit escrow servicey to me.
It does a little bit, yes, like a debt coming back. And, I guess having been in jail for all this time, that enforced hodling, if it was a debt that's being repaid, it's done quite handsomely for him. I mean, $30 million worth of Bitcoin, like that's not nothing to be sneezed at. Donated to his... to his funds by mysterious persons that I think was at Chainalysis did the work to kind of dig through the various mixers and tumblers and other, kind of exchanges that had been through, and pointed the finger back to someone who was selling on Alphabay.
Yeah.
Way back in the early 2010s.
Yes, I mean, that amount of Bitcoin when Ulbricht was busted wasn't actually worth all of that much, which is why it feels like, here, hold these three. But I mean, I'm just speculating. I've got no idea. Yeah. Could entirely just be a donation. But there you go, from prison to pardon to, presumably life of luxury now. I would say, though, that if this were to occur in Australia, and I'm not sure what the laws are like in the United States on this, given these funds are linked to criminal activity, like, they'd just be seized by the government. They would say these are proceeds of crime, there's proceeds of crime legislation here, which would mean yoink, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Like, you clearly did not do the work to earn this money in a sensible way. We can't point out exactly, but
yeah,
come
exactly.
on,
Sorry,
hand it
pal,
over, buddy.
you can't keep it. Yeah. I mean, they do that all the time. Like, they roll up on a bunch of, bikers or whatever, and just say, that's a nice Bentley there, pal. How did you buy it? Bring the tow truck. Now, look, we're going to end with just a funny story, I think, which is that an Australian Navy ship managed to, like, DOS radio comms in a fairly large area of your country the other day, Adam.
Yes, it was, I think it was like quite a big ship in the Australian Navy, was actually still out in international waters, had its radar on, and a number of kind of regional wireless internet providers that use the 5 gigahertz band had their, all of their services disrupted by this radar. And there was a lot of whinging and blaming the Australians for being irresponsible. Like, someone said, oh, the Australians never leave port, so they didn't know that they were supposed to turn it off when they're near land or something. But the kind of reality of this here is that these are ISPs using dirty bands that are meant for radar use. And in order to have, like, the license for using the spectrum range in New Zealand basically means if a radar wants to use your bands, you have to GTFO the band.
Yes.
And you have to use, they call it DFS, dynamic frequency, something, which basically, you just have to shut up and change frequency when you see a radar. And of course, the Australian radar was bigger than all of the available frequencies. And so these wireless ISPs were basically just had to shut down and wait. And if they wanted that to not happen, they could have paid the $150 a year for an actual allocated spectrum license where the radar wouldn't stomp on them. So there was a lot of QQ from the wireless providers in question.
That's funny, right? Like,
ultimately, the Australians just said, "Oh, sorry," and turned the radar off. So
it's funny because this is, like, perfectly encapsulates the Australia-New Zealand relationship, which is family. We're family. We're right next to each other down in this sort of isolated part of the world. We love each other deeply, but we love to scrap.
Yes, we do, and blame each other for this kind of shenanigans. And I'm sure when a New Zealand ship visits Australia sometime, we'll just leave our radar on, assuming that we can afford the wattage. We probably can't afford the fuel to run the radar. But
you're building a ship?
I'm sure we've got radar.
You're building a ship? When does it launch?
I mean, after that one sunk on the reef in Samoa, wherever it was, that it was meant to be surveying a reef, right. And it sailed into the reef, and then...
You did have a ship, yeah.
We did have a ship, yeah.
Anyway, we're going to wrap it up there. Love you, Kiwis, by the way. Fantastic.
Aww.
Well, we do, and I will just say too, it's been, like, I still hang around a bit on X, And what's been really weird is watching the American right posting a lot of videos of like Kiwis doing the haka and like sort of ridiculing it and whatever. And I just say, like, you know, that pisses me off as an Australian, like to a very high degree. I just think, you know, leave them alone. Which is also part of the, I guess, the relationship, isn't it? Which is like being mean to Kiwis is our job, and we don't do it like that. That is too far. Don't do that. But yeah, big love to all the Kiwis, and sorry we DOSed your wireless internet with our Navy. That's it for this week's show. Adam, thank you very much for joining me. It was great to chat, and yeah, we'll do it all again next week.
No, you're most welcome, Pat. Talk to you then.
That was Adam Boileau there with a check of the week's security news. Now it is time for this week's sponsor interview, and we're chatting with Alex Tilley, who these days works in a threat intelligence role at Okta. But some listeners might remember Alex from his time at the Australian Federal Police, where he worked as an investigator for many years and was a regular fixture around the security and hackathons in Australia and New Zealand. And yeah, a friend of mine as well, who I haven't spoken to in a few years. So it was really good to be able to do this interview. So yeah, as I mentioned, Alex has a background as an investigator. So when he took this job with Okta, it meant that he was able to access all sorts of data around identity events, and, you know, with the remit of like, well, what can we investigate here? What can we find? He's been spending a bunch of time looking at what North Koreans are doing in terms of these fake IT worker scams. So both from the perspective of them putting out job ads that they want people to apply to so they can drop malware on them, also from the perspective of just getting in there, getting salaries, and also getting in there and dropping malware, and on and on and on. So yeah, Alex joined me for this interview that I let run a little long because I thought it was very, very interesting, where he talks about all of his work analyzing, you know, Okta data to tie together what these North Korean operations look like. Enjoy.
So from the research, there's three different angles that I'm really looking at here. One is you've got North Koreans applying for jobs at legitimate companies. So they just search for, you know, remote full stack developer job and then probably spam applications. That is sort of brought up with the second model of it, which is they're hosting fake job ads and they're generating these opportunities that as jobs that don't exist, to draw in legitimate applications to then understand, okay, well, what does a good CV look like for a full stack developer? What does a good CV look like for someone with this many years of experience? What sort of school should I have gone to? These types of things to build that quorum of knowledge as to who they're supposed to be when they become the job applicant. And then there's the third point of view, which is, there's the third angle on this, which is the whole get people to apply for jobs and then deploy malware on their machines to also conduct reconnaissance. Like it's a full-featured rats that they deploy to then, you know, harvest either, you know, what does their development system look like on their laptop, what sort of tooling are they using, or anything that they can do to make their own personas look more legitimate and get past those instant sort of allow or deny gates on these applications.
Yeah, there's that whole, if you want this development job, you got to download this image and do the coding challenge. And it's just, you know, a giant blob of malware and whatever.
Yeah, go to Git and it's got a little bit of, you know, a little 5K of obfuscated JavaScript goodness added into the end of it, and off you go. Yeah.
So, you know, you're looking at this, you're working at Okta, obviously. And, you know, how do you then, when your main source of data is like login events and identity events like that, like how do you begin to start tracking all of this behavior? Like how were you able to tie this together and actually draw some insights out?
It's a lot of times it's around talking to customers and saying, hi, you know, we've seen some accounts being used. We're trying to figure out what it is they're up to. And obviously most of these customers won't tell us this individual is doing this, but it very much is because of privacy information, of course. There's, you know, no one's sure that these accounts are North Koreans at that point. It's about, you know, does this look strange to you? And they'll say, yeah, it looks strange. That person was looking at job ads, or that person was generating CVs, etc., like that. And with that, and then the subsequent login events that we see from other customers, we can build a picture of their whole toolkit. What are the services that they're using to generate these identities to make them look more attractive, to look more legitimate, to then go forth and apply for jobs to then get employment. So it's around sort of doing that homework piece in the back end. So it's not just about that spammed CV to a job ad somewhere. It's about this whole back end infrastructure of tradecraft being set up to make sure that that spam CV looks good and will get them past that first line.
So, you talked about going to a customer and saying, hey, this identity, we think it might be up to no good. How are you actually, landing on that detection in the first place? How are you actually getting this preliminary list of like shady identities?
It's generated through a lot of different reasons, through a lot of different methods, really. It's around, sometimes people say, hey, I've identified this account as being probable DPRK, and we have a look at it for them, and we see, okay, well, there's a really base level of about 5 or 6 different services that a lot of these individuals will use to start with. And I can identify those 5 or 6 services and say, yes, if it's an account using, let's say, this particular VPN provider, someone who knows has identified it as being probable DPRK, and I can see it using one of these, commonly used services over time. And then I can then pivot off that and say, okay, well, what other IPs were they using? What are, basically, investigation.
Yeah. So you can say, we think this one's sus because it's doing all of the things that we normally associate with DPRK-like behavior. What else have you got on this identity? And then away you go. So, you mentioned the 3, angles to all of this. What have you been able to learn through doing this research? It's funny, actually, I spoke to your colleague, Brett Winifred, about, you coming in to do this interview, and he told me that when you came on board at Okta, you were just like, oh my God, data, so much data. But what have you been able to learn from all of this, Okta data in terms of like how these schemes are operating and, also where the vulnerable points might be?
Yeah, it really has been really fascinating to me to learn and see them using this back end, almost like a development life cycle, to really get these applications through all the ringers and jump through all the hoops that we as hiring companies may do to put them through to make sure that their applications look the best and have the most chance of success. They know which HR systems have what sort of scoring. They know what a good CV looks like. They know sometimes what VPN service to not use because it's been publicized which ones they do use, so they sort of move away from those VPN services. Just like in the olden days of publications of where botnets sit and do their bulletproof hosting, they tended to migrate away from that. Similar in this case. And then through using all these different systems around webcam identification, like if I conduct an interview with an AI that's tuned to look for webcam fakes or webcam filters, etc., will I get passed? Will I get detected by these systems? And when I look at these customers and say, okay, well, here's a probable DPRK email address or identity using this particular service that advertises that they detect deep fakes or they detect fake webcam filters and overlays, etc. That to me shows that they are using those systems to try and say, okay, well, will I get picked up? Will I get past that step? And it's all about just advancing that one step after another to try and get closer to an individual for an interview, to try and keep a job for a few months.
Yeah, I mean, what I find fascinating about this, right, is that you've got a situation where you can track a single identity going to all of these different touch points, and you can infer, you told me earlier, you can infer from like how much time they spend where, like kind of what they're doing and what the life cycle is of establishing these identities. What I don't quite understand is why they're using the same identities to do all of these different things in the touch point, to like do all of this research. And I'm guessing it's got to be just kind of laziness.
It does appear that some people have a certain way that they like to do business, and some of the facilitators like to just use 1 or 2 different email accounts as their account to sign up for all these services, to try them, to then use them until they get burned or get turned off or stop working. It does just seem to be, this is how I do my job. The interesting part about it though is that the reverse is also true. When I look at some of these identities and what they're doing, there's a lot of discipline there, and by that I mean they're only really using either job-related stuff or actual work connection sort of stuff that we sort of see through customers or whatever. But we're not seeing them doing a lot of just personal browsing, or at least connecting to services that we have a touch point on. So very, very much is like the actual workers themselves are sticking to that particular path of only using those accounts for work purposes, which is interesting.
Yeah, so there's some segregation there, which enables you, which will stop you from being able to pin down their real identities and correlating that to their work identities, but you can still track their work identities across a large number of different services.
Exactly, and understand what they're doing over time.
So the question becomes, like, what do we do with all of this information now that you've built a bit of a sort of, pattern for these types of... Look, I'm guessing you are able now to run some sort of batch, threat hunting and just run some custom queries against Okta and a whole bunch of these identities fall out. I mean, is that what you're doing? And then from there, what do you do with that?
Yeah, definitely working in the direction of making it much more automated. It's really much about trying to understand as, again, they shift their tradecraft over time, trying to make sure that we keep up with what are the new customers that they're using, where are they moving to now, so we can make sure that we understand what they're doing right now. And a lot of that is historical looking to sort of see, okay, well, you might pick up an identity a month later. Someone might say, hey, we just sacked this person for being a potential DPRK worker. And then I can look back historically and say, okay, what were they doing? So it's a little bit historical in that respect to sort of try and get that fingerprint, for want of a better term, of what they were doing, and then understand what we can do with that going forward to look for that. So things like keeping quorums of email addresses, that sort of stuff, are definitely useful for future proofing, because they do, as we've discussed, tend to use similar email addresses for quite a little while. So that's definitely useful for sure.
Yeah. So I'm guessing from an Okta perspective, the priority is to be able to, where possible, be able to flag to customers, hey, we think this identity that's interacting with you is probably a North Korean, fake worker. And, I'd imagine you would want to, squash those identities and then just to be able to detect and notify. Is that kind of the thing? I'd imagine you'd be passing some of this stuff to law enforcement as well.
Definitely part of it. Definitely trying to work down those paths to try and get some sort of remediation done. But a lot of what I'm doing now is understanding that this is not just a high-tech industry thing. This is not just like a FANG thing, shall we say. This is all verticals. And that's the interesting part about what's falling out of the research, is that when we actually see them logging into, let's say, a client that they've successfully got a job with, we're not, and we look back and say, okay, well, what was that particular company advertising for? We're seeing manufacturing, we're seeing healthcare, we're seeing all kinds of different verticals, all advertising for full stack developers. People seem to think this is like a large tech problem, but it's not. It's any vertical that's advertising for these people is getting these applications and probably is going to at least interview one or two of these people. So it's about getting that information out there to people saying, hey, hiring managers, you need to be aware that if something looks funny and smells funny, it could be worth looking into. And that's a really big part of it. People seem to think that that's just the high end of town's problem. But it really is individual small organizations' problem. That's sort of why, me, I like to tell people what to worry about. And in this case, it's sort of like, if you're advertising for these remote developer jobs, doesn't matter what size your organization is, you need to be aware of this particular problem, because it's probably going to get worse because they seem to be having some success.
Yeah, I mean, look, as best I can tell, the MO seems to be raise money for the motherland. Quite often they'll just take the jobs, half-ass it, only do a few hours a week work, and they've probably got 5 or 10 jobs on the go at once, and it's just about raising revenue. Then they might, drop some shells, get some persistence, see if there's anything else they can do there. I mean, I'm wondering if ransomware is going to feature more heavily in all of this in the future. And of course, if they land somewhere that's at all adjacent to cryptocurrency, they're going to try to pivot into theft. But when it comes to these businesses that you've just been talking about, like, not exactly ma and pa, but like SMEs, I mean, what's the actionable advice you can give them that will really help them to defeat this? Because I guess ultimately what it comes down to is just really carefully vetting remote hires, trusting your gut, and then monitoring them once they've started.
Yeah, that's the key point, right? And that's probably one of the key parts of this is it's about vetting up front, understanding, okay, are there any red flags that we've got to look for? Is there anything that's pinging straight away saying this is weird? But it's also about, okay, a month down the track, is the person that you hired today still the person doing that job in a month's time? And that's the bit where a lot of places seem to fall down, is they may invest heavily in time and effort initially to verify the person, but they don't really come around and do another quick round of verification later on.
I mean, is it possible there from what you're saying that the person who got through the application process and the interview and got the job isn't the person who's then on the tools doing the work?
Entirely possible.
Yeah.
We've seen that through all kinds of other crime types. We saw back through in the days of money laundering, etc. Well, in the days when I was involved in money laundering.
When you were involved in countering money laundering, I think we need to be clear there.
Yeah, I'm not quite rich enough for that sort of thing yet. That was around, hey, student, here's $500. Could you go and open a bank account for me? Show up, give your identity, and then just give me the card and the means of accessing the account, right? That was a very basic way it was working. We're seeing it similar with this. It's like, hey, person X, could you be me on this webcam interview? Could you answer these questions, etc., like that? and then hand over control of those accounts. That's particularly one way that I believe it's happening. It's hard to see that one happening all the time, but it definitely is the case where you see one person who may not be, a white guy from Texas, or shall we say, who then is a different non-white guy from Texas 2 months later. And that's the interesting part about this, is trying to sort of track that changes over time. And a lot of organizations struggle with that, obviously, because of profiling reasons, etc., which we won't go into. But there is that scenario of, is that person the same person 2 or 3 months later on?
Yeah, all right. So look, any final words for people out there who might be, I mean, it's difficult, right? Because one of the things is this is a well understood issue in cybersecurity, but the people who are best positioned to do something about it are HR teams, not cybersecurity teams. But, are there any parting words that you would have for people on the security side of things, how they might help their colleagues in HR kind of deal with this, detect it and whatnot?
Yeah, and you've hit the nail on the head there. It is our colleagues in HR. It is definitely about us as security people getting involved with the HR people as much as we can to understand, well, what data sources are available there to us? What can we actually log into to see, can we as a security team add value to say, hey, this person's logging into an interview via an XVPN connection, that's weird. Or this person seems to be using a webcam filter, or their CV was created by the same person as other CVs. These are technical tricks that we can do as security people if we get involved with our colleagues in HR. And our colleagues in HR and hiring managers, really it's about being aware. And that's unfortunately is the hard bit about the job that I'm trying to do here, is to say, just be aware and have a look, and don't think that you're not getting targeted, because you probably are. And understand that, what's my pathways internally where something looks strange. Maybe it's a coworker says, hey, that particular guy on my team hasn't been at a team meeting for 6 weeks. Or, their code seems to be just generated out of an AI or something like that. Something strange here. Do you have a pathway for those team members to raise a red flag and say, hey, can someone have a look into this person? Because obviously we're in different time zones, all kinds of different things going on, but something doesn't smell right. Because technically we can do a fair bit to, identify there's something strange here, but really it is the co-workers and the managers who can see that. And the extra bit I will say is that if I call you, please answer the phone. I'd love to talk to you and try and help you.
Yeah. No, look, everything that you've just said makes sense. Security people need to think about what services they can offer to, or the whole organization, how they can raise awareness, how they can tell people, hey, this is something that's happening. And, here's the number you call, or here's the person you email when you're sus, and this is what we'll do to look into it. Alex, we're out of time, mate, but it was fantastic to see you. Alex is an old mate of mine, and, in fact, lived very close to my mum's house in Melbourne many years ago. So when I would travel down to see Melbourne, we'd always make sure we snuck in a few beers. Great to see you again, my friend, and we will chat again soon.
You too. Thanks, Pat.
That was Alex Tilley there from Okta with this week's sponsor interview. Big thanks to him for that, and big thanks to Okta for being this week's sponsor. And that is it for this week's show. I do hope you enjoyed it. I'll be back soon with more security news and analysis, but until then, I've been Patrick Gray. Thanks for listening.